Welcome to Gospel Tangents Podcast. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to announce that this is our 100th episode here at Gospel Tangents. Of course, I've been around for them all. I'm not sure if you have, but I hope you have. It's been a fun ride so far. In our next conversation, we'll talk to Dr. Greg Prince. Previously, we discussed the gay policy, which disallows children of gay parents from receiving blessings or baptisms or ordinations in the LDS Church. It seems like this policy was started perhaps when President Monson was more incapacitated than he has been in the past. Is there a leadership vacuum? Dr. Greg Prince will talk more about this, and I'll ask if there are similarities between the 1969 policy on blacks. Is that similar to the policy with gays? Check out our conversation. Since this is our 100th episode, and since Christmas is on the way, I'd like to announce a special promotion. We're putting all of our books and Kindle books on sale now. They'll all be a big percentage off. So if you weren't able to purchase it over Black Friday weekend or Cyber Monday, here's your chance to get a discount. You can give it as a gift to your friends or family or to yourself. It'll be a fun thing to learn more about Mormon history, and I hope you'll purchase one of these transcripts. It will really help me out, and hopefully we can keep producing more impressive documentaries on this. We're just beginning, and I know that we can do a lot of good work together. So thank you for your help. Now back to our conversation. So what I'm seeing here, and tell me if you agree with this perception, it seems to me, and it was funny that you mentioned this all started in 1968, because in 1969, as I understand it from Michael Quinn, there was a vote in the Quorum of 12 to allow blacks to hold the priesthood, and then this vote was later rescinded. It seems like in 68, 69, President McKay was more feeble, wasn't really leading the church as much. And so it's, according to Quinn, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree with this, according to Quinn, there seemed to be some jockeying for leadership to lead the church while President McKay was ailing. In our current day, it seems like President Monson, much like President McKay, is ailing mentally quite a bit. And I've heard rumors that certain members of the quorum kind of sprung this on everybody else. And it sounds to me that there's a lot of parallels between 1969 and 2015. Could you comment on that?
Lester Bush and Brent Rushforth and I published an article a year ago in Dialogue, and it was called Gerontocracy and the Future of Mormonism. What we did was to go back to 1897, because that was the year that the church began to publish a General Conference report. So it's a beginning to end transcript of what went on during the General Conference. All of the discourses, verbatim, whatever statistical reports were given, because we were trying to put objective measurements to fitness for duty for a general authority. That's kind of a euphemistic way of describing it. But trying to give an objective look at when did we get to the point where medicine was keeping people alive longer from the neck down than from the neck up, basically. And so what we did was to look at all of these General Conference reports, and that's more than 100 years worth, times 2 per year. One thing that became apparent very quickly is there was one group that always spoke at General Conference if they were in town and physically capable of doing so, and that was the Q15, Quorum of the 12 plus First Presidency. Presiding bishopric, the 70s, used to speak in every General Conference before it became a larger bureaucracy. And then when President Kimball reconstituted the first Quorum of 70, and you had so many 70s you couldn't identify them anymore, then the 70s didn't speak at every General Conference, and it was during the Kimball administration that we went from a 3-day conference to a 2-day conference. So that cut it even more. But without fail, if the Q15 were present and able for duty, they spoke. So we said, all right, let's just take a tally. And so we looked at the Q15 for over 100 years and just filled out this huge database with over 3,000 data points in it, and said, what are the trends here? Up until the 1960s, rarely did a member of that group miss more than one general conference before he died. And frequently, they wouldn't miss any general conferences. Within the 6-month interval between general conferences, they went downhill and died without missing. With President McKay, you had the first time when a church president had a prolonged period where he was not able to stand and deliver a general conference address. Now, that's not to say that he or the others that we measured had dementia. It just said their physical and or mental constitution was such that they were not able to stand or even sit at the podium and deliver the address. Either nothing was said or they would have a surrogate. In the case of President McKay, it was one of his sons who frequently would deliver the address on behalf of his father. So it's the late 1960s when medicine advanced to the point where it was keeping people alive significantly longer than in the past, but not from the neck up. In the case of President McKay, that period was maybe 3 or 4 years. His was a little different situation than the later presidents who had incapacitation, in that he kind of cycled between lucidity and non-lucidity. I interviewed his personal physician in preparation for doing the biography, and he said up until just a few weeks before his death, there were times when he was perfectly lucid. But it was during that period that there turned out to be this war of the titans between Hugh Brown on the one side, the first counselor in the first presidency, and Harold B. Lee, assisted by Alvin Dyer, who was quite racist, because a letter written to the McKay sons by Sterling McMurran had recounted in 1968 an interview that McMurran had had with President McKay in 1954. Now, Sterling never talked about this. He felt because it was a private meeting, he should keep the contents private. But by 1968, with President McKay's health clearly in decline, he wrote this letter to Llewellyn McKay and then sent copies to the other 3 brothers, saying, I think you need to have this within your family records. And he described what that conference had been. Lawrence McKay, the oldest of the sons, took that letter to his father and said, this is what we got from Sterling McMurran. Does this accurately represent what you told him? And he read it, and he said, yes, it does. Well, the main thing that set off the Battle of the Titans was that in 1954, Sterling had said, look, I'm being put on trial for my church membership because I'm considered a heretic. And there are some things I just don't buy, and one of them is this ban on priesthood ordination of blacks. And President McKay said, that's a policy, and the time will come when that will change. Well, he hadn't told other people that. He hadn't even told his counselors or members of the quorum that during those intervening years. I spoke with Ed Kimball, the son of Spencer Kimball, and his biographer, twice his biographer, and said, was there anything in your father's records that suggested that he had had discussions with President McKay on the issue of blacks and priesthood? He said, there was not one thing in there. So he really had held it tight. When this letter was sent to the McKay sons, Lawrence McKay showed it to Hugh Brown, but Alvin Dyer, who was an extra counselor in the first presidency, also got a copy of it, and he freaked out and took it to Harold B. Lee. Lee pretty much freaked out because both sides, seeing that McKay considered it a policy, assumed that, okay, if it's a policy, then it can be changed. That was the good news for Brown. It was the bad news for Lee and for Dyer. So there was some real heavy-duty sparring going on. I talked to Ed Firmage, who was a grandson of Hugh Brown, and he was the one who told me, yes, my grandfather tried to change that administratively, and that's why he was released from the first presidency after McKay died. But all of that occurred in a period where there was a power vacuum. President McKay, even though he was lucid enough to talk to his son and verify the contents of that letter, physically didn't have the capacity to referee this match or to stop it. It was carried on mostly in private, so the general church membership didn't know about it, but it was a real crisis. So that was power vacuum number one. Power vacuum number two happened when Spencer Kimball began suffering subdural hemorrhages and had to have at least, as I recall, 2 cranial surgeries to remove the blood clots. So his physical and mental capacity began to diminish significantly. His was the second presidency where there had been a prolonged period of incapacitation, about 4 years. Well, during power vacuum number 2 there, you had the dismantling of the history division within the historical department. This was Leonard Arrington's franchise. And one wonders how that could happen when Spencer Kimball had been so affirming to Leonard of what he was doing. And the answer is, when there's a power vacuum, then those who are most capable of filling the vacuum will fill the vacuum. And the way this church is set up, that means who's the next senior guy? If he's sitting as a counselor in the first presidency, you're likely not to see that much of a blip. If he's sitting in the Quorum of the 12, then you may. And the next guy in line was Ezra Taft Benson. So it was Ezra Benson, Mark Peterson, and a junior apostle named Boyd Packer, who successfully dismantled the history division and sent the historians packing to BYU. Power vacuum 3 was with Ezra Taft Benson, who was basically totally incapacitated for almost 5 years. And the efforts by some church leaders to try to deny that resulted directly in the very high-profile defection of Steve Benson, one of the grandsons, who said, look, you're propping up my grandfather and trying to say he's running the church. My grandfather can't even utter a coherent sentence. Power vacuum number 4 is what we're seeing right now. That you have seen a diminishing of President Monson's capacity ever since he became church president in 2008. He held one press conference right after he became president. That's been it. If you look at the role he has played in general conferences, it's been since 2009 since he conducted a session. For the last 2 general conferences, instead of giving the customary 4 addresses, he cut down to 2, and they were basically, for those of us old enough to remember, 2.5-minute talks. And it's in power vacuum number 4 that the policy emerges. Now, that doesn't tell you the details of how these things happened, but it tells you the climate in which they did happen. And in each case, it was a power vacuum created by the incapacitation of the sitting president.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Greg Prince. In our next conversation, we'll continue to talk about LDS power vacuums. We'll also talk about the idea of a floating temple or a temple on a plane.
The first one didn't float, and the second one didn't fly.
Click here to subscribe, click here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some other videos that we've done here on YouTube. We hope you'll use this as a valuable resource to learn more about Mormon history.